Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here today. I'm excited to introduce our topic, Understanding the Macroeconomy Through the Aggregate Demand, Aggregate Supply Framework. The title might sound a bit technical, but don't worry. I'll guide you through it step by step. Today, we'll explore how demand and supply interact to shape the overall economy. We'll look at the key concepts, see how they fit together, and understand their real-world implications. So, let's get started and dive into this fascinating dance of demand and supply. Let's explore how we can evaluate fiscal and monetary decisions through a useful lens. This approach helps us see the impact of policies on the economy clearly. When we talk about policy evaluation, we're really looking at the path towards sustainable economic growth, making sure that the decisions we make today support long-term stability and prosperity. Now, for understanding the economy over time, we need to consider different perspectives. Long-run analysis helps us see how policies influence growth trends, and it also reveals the factors behind fluctuations, recessions, and booms. This gives us a broader view of economic health over time. On the other hand, short-run analysis focuses on more immediate responses. Here, economists often rely on the ADAS model, the Aggregate Demand and Aggregate Supply Framework. This model is foundational because it illustrates how the overall price level interacts with total economic output, or real GDP. It helps us understand how economies respond to shocks, whether through contractions or expansions. Finally, when we step back and look at the big picture, what truly drives an economy? It's the complex interplay of factors, policies, and behaviors that influence overall economic activity. By understanding these key points, we can better grasp how decisions shape economic outcomes and how to steer them towards sustainable growth. Let's take a closer look at the components of aggregate demand. First, we have net exports, which is calculated as X minus M, or exports minus imports. When domestic goods become more expensive, it tends to reduce exports because foreign buyers might look elsewhere, and it increases imports because domestic consumers want cheaper foreign goods. This means that higher domestic prices can actually shrink net exports, impacting overall demand. Next, we see government spending, labeled as G. This is straightforward. When the government increases spending, it directly boosts aggregate demand by purchasing goods and services. Then there's investment, or I. Rising prices can have a dampening effect here too. This is due to what we call the foreign price effect. When domestic prices go up, foreign buyers might buy less from us, again reducing exports and increasing imports, which lowers net exports. Another important factor is consumer spending, or C. As prices rise, the real value of household wealth decreases, making people less likely to spend. This is what we refer to as the wealth effect. Now, let's understand how these components relate to the overall curve of aggregate demand. The AD curve slopes downward because, as prices increase, the total demand for goods and services tends to fall. This happens for three main reasons. First, the foreign price effect reduces net exports when domestic prices go up. Second, the interest rate effect occurs because rising prices increase the demand for money, which can push interest rates higher and make borrowing more expensive. Thus, investment declines. And third, the wealth effect diminishes household spending as higher prices erode real wealth. Together, these effects help explain why aggregate demand is not a flat line, but slopes downward, illustrating the inverse relationship between price levels and total demand in the economy. Let's take a closer look at the vertical line at potential GDP. This line represents the level of output the economy can sustainably produce in the long run, given our available resources and technology. In the long run, input prices like wages and materials fully adjust, which means the economy reaches its maximum sustainable capacity. This is the point where the economy is operating at its true potential, without overheating or underperforming. Now moving on to the long-run aggregate supply, or LRAS. You'll notice it slopes upward, and that's because when output prices increase, but input costs stay fixed in the short run, firms see higher profit margins. This encourages them to produce more, which explains the upward slope. But in the long run, as input prices adjust, the economy stabilizes at its maximum capacity, represented by that vertical line. Let's also remember what the short-run aggregate supply, or SRAS, entails. It shows the total output firms are willing to produce at each price level, but unlike the long run, it can behave quite differently depending on the time frame. In the short run, prices and wages might not adjust immediately, which can lead to different supply responses. Finally, all of this ties back to our overall theme. Aggregate supply is essentially the economy's production engine. It's what drives the output level depending on price changes and time horizons, helping us understand how the economy responds to various shocks and policies over different periods. So the gap between short-run and long-run equilibrium is really what drives economic cycles and sparks policy debates. When aggregate demand, or AD, shifts to the right, we see higher output and prices in the short run. That means more goods and services are produced, but prices also tend to rise. Now, if the short-run aggregate supply, or SRAS, shifts to the left, it leads to higher prices but actually lower output. This situation is what we call stagflation, rising prices coupled with stagnating or declining output. Long-run equilibrium is reached where the AD curve crosses the long-run aggregate supply, or LRAS. This is the point where the economy is operating at its sustainable capacity. The key concept here is that the equilibrium point occurs where the AD and SRAS curves intersect. This intersection determines the current price level and the real GDP output. That is, how much the economy is actually producing right now. Understanding this model helps us see where demand and supply meet, and how shifts in either can influence the overall economy. It's a fundamental part of analyzing economic fluctuations and policy responses. Let's take a closer look at the short-run fluctuations of real GDP around the potential output. When aggregate demand, or AD, exceeds the long-run aggregate supply, LRAS, we see economic booms. During these times, resources are fully utilized and the economy is growing rapidly. Conversely, when AD falls short of LRAS, we experience recessions, which lead to underutilized resources and slower growth. These are the typical ups and downs in the business cycle that happen in the short run. Now, moving on to inflation. This is a sustained increase in the general price level, and it often occurs when there's a rightward shift in AD, known as demand pull inflation, or a leftward shift in short-run aggregate supply, called cost-push inflation. If inflation isn't kept in check, it can erode our purchasing power, making goods and services more expensive over time. On the other hand, economic growth is driven by a rightward shift of LRAS. This shift results from improvements like advances in productivity, capital accumulation, technological innovation, and better institutions. These factors are what push living standards upward over the long term, fueling sustained economic progress. So, in summary, these dynamics, growth, inflation, and business cycles, are interconnected. Understanding how shifts in AD and AS affect the economy helps us better grasp the overall picture of economic fluctuations and progress. Now let's talk about stagflation, which is a particularly challenging situation for the economy. When the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts sharply to the left, it creates a scenario where prices are rising while output is falling at the same time. This is often called the worst of both worlds because you're facing inflation and recession simultaneously. A real-world example of this was during the 1970s oil shocks, where oil prices skyrocketed and caused both inflation and economic slowdown. There are several factors that can cause these shifts in aggregate supply. For example, rising input prices, like wages or oil, push the SRAS curve to the left because production becomes more expensive, reducing supply. On the flip side, technological improvements or gains in productivity tend to shift both SRAS and long-run aggregate supply to the right, boosting output and helping control prices over time. Natural disasters are another factor. They can disrupt supply chains, which again contracts the SRAS curve temporarily. Now, shifting gears to aggregate demand, consumer and business confidence play a big role. When optimism runs high, spending tends to increase, shifting AD to the right. Conversely, pessimism can lead to decreased spending and a leftward shift. Fiscal policy, through government spending and taxes, directly influences AD as well. And monetary policy, like changes in interest rates, affects borrowing and investment, which also shifts AD. Finally, global conditions matter too. Changes in foreign demand or exchange rates can impact net exports, further shifting the aggregate demand curve. So, as you can see, both aggregate supply and demand are influenced by a variety of factors, and understanding these shifts helps us grasp the overall picture of economic fluctuations. On this slide, we see how macroeconomic views integrate both short-term and long-term perspectives. In the short run, aggregate demand tends to dominate, meaning that changes in demand can significantly influence economic output and employment. Conversely, in the long run, aggregate supply is the key driver, shaping the economy's productive capacity and overall growth. Most central banks and governments today operate within this combined framework, balancing demand management with supply-side policies. Moving to the core ideas, we have the mainstream synthesis, which blends the insights of Keynesian and classical economics. Keynes' law, which states that demand creates its own supply, highlights that during downturns, insufficient demand can lead to unemployment, and active fiscal stimulus is necessary to stabilize the economy. It's about boosting demand to get the economy moving again. On the other hand, Say's law, supply creates its own demand, emphasizes that markets are self-correcting over the long term. The focus here is on increasing productive capacity through policies that promote supply, rather than trying to manage demand directly. These contrasting views reflect the fundamental debates in macroeconomics about how governments should respond to fluctuations. Should they stimulate demand during recessions, or focus on enhancing supply-side factors? Both schools offer valuable insights, and understanding their differences helps us grasp the broader discussion about economic policy. In the end, these debates form the foundation of macroeconomic thought, guiding policymakers in navigating economic cycles effectively. Policymakers are constantly walking a tightrope, trying to find that perfect balance. They want to stimulate enough growth to keep employment high and people working, but at the same time, they need to avoid overheating the economy. Overheating can lead to rising prices, what we call inflation. So it's really a perpetual balancing act. And that's where the ADAS model comes into play. Think of it as a map or a guiding tool that helps policymakers navigate this complex terrain. It shows them how different policies and economic conditions can shift the aggregate demand and aggregate supply curves. By understanding this model, policymakers can better predict how their actions might impact overall economic activity, inflation, and employment. It's all about steering the economy in the right direction, promoting growth without letting inflation spiral out of control. That's the core challenge they face every day, and the ADAS model is essential in helping them make informed decisions. So, to wrap things up, the key takeaway here is that understanding the interaction between aggregate demand and aggregate supply is really central to grasping how any economy is doing, where it's headed, and what the future might hold. This framework provides a clear lens through which we can analyze economic health and trends. Now, a natural question is, should the government step in to influence these forces? And if so, which school of thought offers the best approach? These are complex questions, and evaluating different responses helps us see the trade-offs involved in policy decisions. Next, we look at how policies or shocks affect the economy by tracing their effects on real GDP, the price level, and employment both in the short run and the long run. This helps us understand the dynamics and potential outcomes of various interventions. Then we want to predict what might happen next. Is there a shift in aggregate demand or supply? And what caused it? Was it policy changes, shifts in consumer or business confidence, or external factors like global events. Identifying these causes is crucial for making informed predictions. Following that, we diagnose the current state of the economy. Are output levels above or below the economy's potential GDP? Are prices rising or falling? This diagnosis guides us in understanding whether the economy is overheating or underperforming. Finally, mastering the ADAS framework is not just an academic exercise. It equips you to interpret economic news more critically, evaluate policy options more effectively, and understand what really drives prosperity or recession in any context. In essence, this model is your economic compass, guiding your understanding of the complex forces shaping our economy now and in the future.